Marcus Chen stood at his office window on the 42nd floor, watching the morning fog roll across San Francisco Bay. In 30 minutes, he would face the woman who had once told him he'd never amount to anything. 20 years later, she was coming to him for a job. The irony tasted sweeter than his morning coffee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 17-year-old Marcus Chen stared at the red F bleeding across his chemistry test, his stomach churning with familiar dread. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Mrs. Patricia Whitman's voice cut through the classroom chatter. "Mr. Chen, stay after class." Those 4 words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known this moment was coming. 3 failed tests, missed assignments, and the constant distraction of working nights at Radio Shack to help his family pay rent. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The classroom felt like a prison. As his classmates filed out, their whispered conversations and pitying glances making Marcus want to disappear entirely. Jessica Martinez, who sat next to him, offered a sympathetic smile before gathering her books. "Good luck," she mouthed silently. Even Brian Thompson, the class clown who usually made jokes about everything, looked somber as he passed Marcus's desk. Marcus remained frozen in his seat, watching Mrs. Whitman organize her papers with the methodical precision that had earned her the nickname the Destroyer among students. Her desk was a fortress of perfectly aligned supplies, red pens arranged by length, grade books stacked with military precision, coffee mug positioned exactly 3 inches from her computer monitor. Everything about her screamed control and order, qualities that Marcus felt were completely absent from his own chaotic life. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like microscopic evidence of his academic failures. The periodic table poster on the wall seemed to mock him, all those elements arranged in perfect order, following rules that made sense to everyone except him. Finally, she looked up, her steel-gray eyes fixing on him with surgical intensity. "Marcus, we need to discuss your future." The word future hit him like a sledgehammer. What is the future? Marcus worked 25 hours a week at Radio Shack, spent his evenings helping his 10-year-old sister Amy with her homework, and fell asleep most nights, wondering if his family would make rent. The concept of a future felt as abstract as the chemical equations he couldn't balance. "I know I messed up the test," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can do better. I just need to stop." Her hand shot up like a traffic signal. "This isn't about one test. This is about a pattern of failure that's been consistent all semester." The words hit him like hammer blows. Marcus had always struggled in school, but hearing it stated so bluntly made his chest tighten with shame. He thought about his parents, immigrants from Taiwan who had sacrificed everything for the promise of American opportunity. His father, once an engineer, now worked double shifts at a plastics factory after the Ford plant closed. His mother cleaned office buildings at night, her hands permanently stained with industrial cleaning chemicals. Mrs. Whitman walked to the window overlooking the school parking lot, where his mother's rusted Honda sat next to newer cars that belonged to families who didn't worry about grocery money. The Honda's passenger door was held shut with duct tape, and the muffler made sounds like a dying animal. Marcus felt the familiar burn of embarrassment every morning when other students saw him emerge from that mechanical disaster. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Marcus?" Shh. He shook his head, though she couldn't see him. His palms were sweating now, leaving damp marks on his jeans. "I see a young man who thinks he can coast through life on excuses, someone who believes the world owes him something without putting in any real effort." She turned back to face him, her expression carved from stone. "But here's reality. The world doesn't care about your potential if you don't have the discipline to realize it." Marcus felt his cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. "That's not fair. You don't know what my life is like outside this classroom." "You're right," she said, surprising him. "I don't know about your job at Radio Shack, or how you help your sister with homework every night, or how your family has struggled. Since the Ford plant laid off your father," his eyes widened in shock. How did she know all that? Had she been investigating him? The thought made his skin crawl. "I don't know about the eviction notice your family received last month, or how you've..." Been skipping lunch to save money for your sister's school supplies. I don't know about the nights you fall asleep at this very desk during study hall because you're exhausted from working until midnight. Marcus's mouth went dry. She knew everything, every humiliating detail of his family's struggle. Every sacrifice he'd made that nobody was supposed to notice. But none of that changes the fact that in my classroom, you've consistently shown you're not willing to do what it takes to succeed. And if you can't succeed here with all the resources available to you, how do you expect to succeed in the real world? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Marcus wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the evidence was stacked against him. His grades were terrible. And despite his genuine fascination with electronics, he'd built his own radio from scratch. Using components from Radio Shack's damaged goods bin, he couldn't translate that passion into academic success. The irony wasn't lost on him. At work, he could diagnose electronic problems that stumped customers twice his age. He could explain the difference between analog and digital signals, troubleshoot circuit boards, and even modify devices to improve their performance. But in this classroom, surrounded by beakers and Bunsen burners, he felt like an imposter. Mrs. Whitman returned to her desk and pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs. I've been teaching for 15 years, Marcus. I've learned to recognize certain patterns. She spread several photos across her desk like tarot cards predicting doom. These are former students who had the same attitude, the same excuses you're making now. Marcus leaned forward despite himself, studying the faces in the photographs. They looked so young, so hopeful. Had they sat in this same chair, feeling the same crushing weight of disappointment? She pointed to each photo in turn, her voice taking on the cadence of a coroner delivering autopsy results. Tommy Rodriguez, 3 years ago. Same seat, same problems. Same story about family circumstances affecting his academic performance. He's unemployed now, living with his mother, playing video games and blaming the economy for his problems. Photo showed a boy with Marcus's same defiant posture, arms crossed, jaw set stubbornly. Sarah Mitchell, brilliant but lazy, made the same promises about trying harder, doing better. She's working fast food now, struggling as a single mother, telling everyone who'll listen that school didn't prepare her for the real world. Sarah's photo showed a girl with intelligent eyes and a skeptical expression, someone who probably thought she was too smart for high school nonsense. David Park, who swore he'd prove me wrong about his business dreams, talked constantly about starting his own company, becoming an entrepreneur. 5 years of minimum wage jobs, moving back in with his parents when his latest venture failed. David's photo made Marcus's heart skip. The boy looked remarkably similar to him. Same determined eyes, same stubborn set to his mouth, same expression that said the world just didn't understand his potential. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as she continued her parade of failures. These weren't just statistics or cautionary tales. These were real people whose dreams had been systematically dismantled. "Here's what's going to happen," Mrs. Whitman said, her voice taking on an almost clinical tone. You're going to fail. My class. Not because I want you to, but because you've chosen to fail. This failure will follow you like a shadow. You'll struggle to get into any decent college if you graduate high school at all, which at this point is questionable. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but she continued relentlessly, building her case with prosecutorial precision. You'll probably end up in some dead-end job, convincing yourself you're waiting for the right opportunity, that you're destined for something bigger. But opportunities don't come to people who haven't prepared for them. You'll watch your classmates move on to universities and careers while you're stuck exactly where you are. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Every word painted a picture of a future that terrified him more than any horror movie. He could see it all: the years of menial work, the gradual erosion of hope, the slow transformation from ambitious teenager to bitter adult. And in 20 years, she said, leaning forward with terrible certainty, you'll still be making excuses for why your life didn't turn out the way you planned? You'll blame the system, your circumstances, bad luck, everyone and everything, except the person actually responsible. She stood and walked back to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. That person is you, Marcus. You are the architect of your own failure? Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not just his pride, but his entire sense of who he might become. The comfortable story he'd told himself about being misunderstood crumbled under her words. The narrative he'd constructed about having hidden potential, about being a diamond in the rough, dissolved like sugar in acid. For a moment, he saw himself through her eyes, a 17-year-old making excuses, blaming circumstances, talking about potential while producing nothing but failure. The image was devastating in its clarity. "You can leave now, Mrs. Whitman," said without turning around. "Your next class is waiting." Marcus gathered his things with shaking hands, his chemistry textbook feeling heavier than concrete. The periodic table poster seemed to blur as his eyes welled with tears he refused to let fall. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time, hoping to see some hint of softness in her expression, some suggestion that she might be wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mrs. Whitman," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes. What if you're wrong about me?" She turned then, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not kindness exactly, but perhaps the smallest acknowledgement that his question was worth asking. "I've been teaching for 15 years, Marcus," she repeated, her voice softer but no less certain. "I'm never wrong about these things." Marcus walked out of that classroom carrying her words like poison in his bloodstream. The hallway stretched endlessly before him. It's filled with the echoing sounds of normal teenage life, locker doors slamming, friends laughing, the ordinary chaos of students who didn't have their entire future dissected and discarded in a single conversation that night. He lay in bed staring at the water-stained ceiling of his family's apartment, replaying every devastating prediction she'd made. The thin walls allowed him to hear his parents' hushed conversation in the kitchen, worried voices discussing late bills and dwindling options. His sister Amy was asleep in the bed across from her homework scattered on the nightstand, complete and perfect as always. The contrast was painful. Amy was everything Marcus wasn't: organized, focused, naturally gifted at academics. She would never sit in Mrs. Whitman's chair, would never hear those crushing words about limitation and failure. Amy was destined for the success that Marcus had apparently forfeited through his own inadequacy. But somewhere in the darkness, as Marcus listened to the familiar sounds of his family's struggle, something else began to grow alongside the hurt and humiliation. It started as a whisper, then built to a roar that drowned out Mrs. Whitman's voice. What if I could prove her wrong? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. What if her 15 years of experience were meaningless? What if her careful predictions were just the prejudices of someone who had given up on believing in human potential? Turned onto his side, staring at the electronics he'd built and repaired, lined up on his dresser like trophies from a different life. In that moment, he made a decision that would define the next 20 years. He would prove Patricia Whitman wrong or die trying. Marcus made a decision that night that would define the next 20 years of his life. If Mrs. Whitman was so certain he would fail, he would make sure her certainty became the biggest mistake she'd ever made. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. The first few weeks after that conversation, Marcus spiraled deeper into the failure she'd predicted. He stopped trying in chemistry, let his other grades slip, and told himself that maybe she was right. Maybe some people were just destined for mediocrity. Every morning he looked in the bathroom mirror of their cramped apartment and heard her voice. "You are the architect of your own failure." The words had burrowed so deep into his psyche that they felt like truth when he struggled with calculus homework, when he fell asleep during English class, when he couldn't concentrate because his stomach was growling from skipping lunch. Mrs. Whitman's prediction felt like destiny fulfilling itself. His co-workers at Radio Shack began to notice the change. Miguel, the assistant manager who'd hired him, pulled Marcus aside during his third week of barely contained anger. "Hey kid, what's eating you?" Miguel asked, leaning against the stockroom wall. "You're usually the guy explaining to customers. why their stereo won't work, and lately you've been acting like the electronics bit you. Marcus wanted to explain, but how could he tell Miguel that a teacher had systematically destroyed his faith in his own potential? How could he admit that every customer interaction felt pointless because he was apparently destined for a lifetime of retail mediocrity? School stuff, Marcus mumbled, avoiding Miguel's concerned gaze. School stuff can't be that bad, Miguel said. You're one of the smartest kids I've ever worked with. Last week, you diagnosed that amplifier problem that had me stumped for 3 hours. That comment hit Marcus like lightning. Miguel, who had 15 years of electronics experience, thought he was smart. Customers regularly asked for him specifically, because word had spread that the kid at Radio Shack could fix things other people couldn't. But Mrs. Whitman, with her advanced degrees and teaching authority, was convinced he was destined for failure. The contradiction created a crack in the foundation of despair. She'd built in his mind. That weekend, Marcus sat in his room, surrounded by the electronic devices he'd repaired and modified, an old radio he'd converted to pick up police frequencies, a broken calculator he'd turned into a digital clock, a discarded computer monitor he'd fixed and upgraded. These weren't the projects of someone destined for failure. These were the creations of someone who understood how things worked, someone who could solve complex problems through trial, error, and stubborn determination. But every time he started to feel hopeful, Mrs. Whitman's voice returned. I've been teaching for 15 years. I'm never wrong about these things. The internal war raged for weeks. Some days Marcus felt capable of conquering the world. Other days he was convinced that his electronic skills were just a fluke, a temporary distraction from his inevitable academic collapse. The uncertainty was exhausting. The turning point came during a particularly brutal October evening. Marcus had failed another chemistry quiz, not just failed, but spectacularly bombed it, scoring a 23 out of 100. Mrs. Whitman had returned the quiz without comment, but her expression said everything. See? I told you so. That night, Marcus came home to find his father, Wei, sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and rejection letters from potential employers. Wei's English was still heavily accented after 20 years in America, and age discrimination had made finding work even harder after the plant closure. Marcus, his father said without looking up, I need to tell you something. Marcus set down his backpack, dreading another conversation about financial stress. Your mother and I, we've been talking. Maybe it's time you consider trade school. Instead of college, learn electrician work, plumbing, something with your hands. You're good with fixing things. The suggestion wasn't an insult. Wei genuinely believed trade work was honorable and practical. But coming on the heels of Mrs. Whitman's predictions, it felt like the universe was conspiring to limit his options. Dad, I don't want to be an electrician, Marcus said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Nothing wrong with electrician. Work, Wei replied, still shuffling through bills. Steady money, good benefits. Better than factory work that disappears overnight. But what if I want more than that? Wei finally looked up, his tired eyes meeting his son's. Want is expensive, Marcus. Reality is what puts food on the table. That night, lying in bed, listening to his parents' worried whispers through thin walls, Marcus felt trapped between two versions of limited expectations. Mrs. Whitman saw him as academically doomed, while his father saw him as practically suited for blue-collar work. Both perspectives, however well-intentioned, felt like cages. But somewhere in the darkness, Marcus remembered something Miguel had said. You're one of the smartest kids I've ever worked with. Not smart for a trade school kid or smart considering your circumstances, just smart, period. What if intelligence couldn't be measured solely by chemistry grades? What if Mrs. Whitman's 15 years of experience had created blind spots rather than insight? What if her careful categorization of students was just another form of prejudice, intellectual bigotry disguised as academic wisdom? Marcus sat up in bed, his heart racing with a possibility that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. What if he didn't have to accept anyone else's limitations on his potential? The next morning, Marcus walked into school with a new sense of purpose. Instead of going directly to his locker, He stopped by the guidance counselor's office, Mrs. Rodriguez. The guidance counselor looked up from her computer with surprise. Marcus had never voluntarily visited her office before. "Marcus, what can I do for you?" "I want to know about colleges," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Not trade schools. Real colleges, universities." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression shifted to something Marcus couldn't quite read. Not discouragement exactly, but carefully managed expectations. "Well, that's wonderful that you're thinking about higher education," she said in the tone adults used when they didn't want to crush dreams too abruptly. "Let's look at your transcripts and see what options might be realistic." There was that word again, realistic. Marcus was beginning to hate it. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up his grades on her computer, her face growing more concerned with each semester she reviewed. "Marcus, your GPA is currently 2.1. Most four-year universities require at least a 3.0, and competitive schools want much higher." "What if I brought my grades up?" Marcus asked. "What if I got A's from now until graduation?" "That would certainly help," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully. "You'd also need strong standardized test scores, extracurricular activities, leadership, experience." She trailed off, clearly seeing the mountain of work required to transform Marcus from failing student to college candidate. "Has anyone ever done it?" Marcus pressed. "Has anyone ever turned around grades that bad and still gotten into a good college?" Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, studying his face. Marcus could see her calculating something, probably. The odds of success versus the risk of encouraging false hope? "It's done," she said finally. "But it requires a complete transformation of study habits, priorities, and commitment level. Most students find it too difficult to sustain, but some do it." "Some do it," she confirmed. That was all Marcus needed to hear. Some people had done what he wanted to do. That meant it was possible. "What would I need to do?" he asked. Mrs. Rodriguez opened a drawer and pulled out several thick folders. "First, you'd need to bring up every single grade in every single class, no exceptions. Second, you'd need to take challenging courses, honors classes, AP if possible. Third, you'd need extracurricular activities that demonstrate leadership and commitment." She spread college brochures across her desk like a roadmap to an impossible destination. "You'd also need to prepare intensively for the SAT or ACT. Most students who make this kind of turnaround spend at least 2 hours every night studying. Plus weekends means sacrificing social activities, reducing work hours if possible, and essentially restructuring your entire life around academic achievement." Marcus stared at the brochures. UC Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford, MIT, schools that seemed to exist in a different universe from his current reality. "How long do I have?" he asked. "If you're serious about this, you'd need to start immediately. Every semester matters at this point. Every grade, every test, every assignment." Marcus gathered up the brochures and information packets, feeling their weight like physical evidence of possibility. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, as he reached the door, "what percentage of students who try this actually succeed?" She hesitated, clearly debating whether honesty would help or hurt his motivation. "Maybe 1 in 20, she said finally. "But the ones who succeed tend to be the ones who refuse to accept other people's limitations." That afternoon, Marcus walked into Mrs. Whitman's chemistry class with a new perspective. Instead of seeing her as the authority figure who controlled his destiny, he saw her as just one person with one opinion. It's an opinion that might be wrong. When she returned his latest, quizzed with another failing grade, Marcus didn't feel the familiar crushing weight of confirmation. Instead, he felt something that surprised him: determination. After class, as other students filed out, Marcus approached her desk. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I want to retake this quiz." She looked up from her grade, book eyebrows raised. "Marcus, you know I don't allow retakes. The grade stands. Then I want extra credit, additional assignments, anything that will help me understand the material better." Mrs. Whitman leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same intensity she'd used during their devastating conversation weeks earlier. "Marcus, we've already discussed your academic trajectory. Wouldn't your time be better spent focusing on more realistic goals?" You told me I was the architect of my own failure, Marcus said, surprising them both with his directness. If that's true, then I can also be the architect of my own success. For the first time since he'd known her, Mrs. Whitman seemed genuinely surprised. She studied his face as if searching for evidence of delusion or false bravado. It's material. Doesn't get easier, Marcus. If anything, it becomes more challenging. Chemistry builds on itself. If you don't understand the fundamentals, you'll struggle even more with advanced concepts. Then I'll learn the fundamentals, Marcus said simply. Whatever it takes. Mrs. Whitman was quiet for a long moment. She spoke. Her voice had lost some of its usual certainty. Extra credit won't fix fundamental comprehension problems. You'd need to basically relearn everything we've covered so far this semester. Fine. It would require hours of additional study time. Time you probably don't have with your work schedule. I'll make time. And even if you improved in chemistry, that's just one class. Your overall academic performance suggests deeper issues. With study skills and commitment, then I'll fix those too. Mrs. Whitman stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Marcus could see her mental gears turning, probably calculating the likelihood that this burst of motivation would last longer than a week. Very well, she said finally, opening her desk drawer. Here's what you missed on the last 3 quizzes. Master this material. Demonstrate genuine understanding, not just memorization, and I'll consider additional opportunities for improvement. She handed him a stack of worksheets that looked like they were written in a foreign language. What? Marcus, she added, her voice returning to its familiar authoritative tone. Don't confuse temporary enthusiasm with sustainable change. I've seen many students start strong and fade when the work becomes difficult. Marcus took the worksheets. Feeling their weight like a challenge? I guess we'll find out, he said. That night. Marcus sat at his desk until 3 a.m., working through problems that seemed designed to break his spirit. Chemical equations that looked like hieroglyphics, concepts that felt deliberately obtuse, calculations that required precision he'd never developed. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten. The satisfaction of gradual understanding. Each small breakthrough, balancing an equation, understanding molecular structure, grasping the logic behind chemical reactions, felt like a small victory against Mrs. Whitman's predictions. By the time he finally went to bed, exhausted, but strangely energized. Marcus had made a decision that would reshape his entire future. He would prove that 15 years of teaching experience could be wrong about one determined. 17-year-old Marcus adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his reflection in his office window. Patricia Whitman's resume lay open on his desk, showing a career that had declined as steadily as his had risen. Roosevelt High School had closed 5 years ago, and since then, she'd struggled to find stable employment in a profession that had moved beyond her rigid philosophy. Mr. Chen? His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Ms. Whitman is here for her interview. Send her in, Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. The door opened, and she walked in, older, grayer, but with the same sharp eyes that had once dissected his future with surgical precision. He watched recognition dawn on her face, watched her composure crack as she realized who was sitting behind the imposing desk. Hello, Mrs. Whitman, Marcus said, savoring each word. Thank you for coming in today. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, her worn portfolio clutched like a shield. Marcus, she whispered, his name coming out like a confession. Please, have a seat. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. We have quite a lot to discuss. As she moved toward the chair, Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her hands. The way her eyes darted around his office, taking in the obvious markers of success. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she remembered their last conversation, whether she understood the magnitude of how wrong she had been. I have to admit, Marcus began, once she was seated. When I saw your name on the interview schedule, I thought there might be some mistake. Patricia Whitman from Roosevelt High School, applying for a position at Harrison Tech. Patricia's throat worked as she swallowed hard. Marcus, I had no idea this was your company when I applied. If I had known, you wouldn't have applied. Marcus interrupted. You're saying you don't think you're qualified for the position? The question was a trap, and they both knew it. Patricia's eyes sharpened, showing a glimpse of her old authority. I'm perfectly qualified. My resume speaks for itself. Marcus leaned back in his chair with deliberate casualness. Yes, I've reviewed your resume. Very impressive on paper. Oh, I noticed some instability in your recent employment history. The education sector has faced significant challenges, Patricia said defensively. Budget cuts, administrative changes, Roosevelt High School, Marcus said quietly. That must have been difficult, watching your life's work disappear. For the first time since entering his office, Patricia's composure cracked. It was heartbreaking, she admitted. Marcus leaned forward. Tell me about your teaching philosophy. How did you approach students who were struggling? He watched her carefully as she answered, explaining her belief in realistic expectations and hard truths. Every word confirmed that 20 years hadn't changed her fundamental approach to education. Can you give me a specific example? Marcus asked. Patricia hesitated, clearly calculating whether to reference their shared history. I found that students often needed reality checks about their academic performance and future prospects. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is help them understand their limitations early. Limitations, Marcus repeated, tasting the word. That's interesting. Let me ask you something. In your 15 years of teaching, did you ever have a student prove your initial assessment wrong? The question hit its mark. Patricia's mouth opened and closed as she struggled with how to answer.
Alex.
Every teacher makes mistakes in judgment sometimes, she said carefully. Do they? Marcus pressed. Because your philosophy suggests those mistakes wouldn't be possible. If you're telling struggling students they're destined to fail, how exactly would they surprise you? Marcus stood and walked to his wall of achievements. But this time, he focused on a different section. Photographs of scholarship recipients. These are people our company has helped get education and training in technology fields. The only requirement is that traditional educational institutions fail them somehow. He pointed to specific photos. This woman was told community college was too ambitious for her English skills. She just graduated with a master's in cybersecurity. This young man was labeled learning, disabled, and tracked into vocational classes. He now holds 3 patents. Patricia stared at the photos, her face pale. You see, Mrs. Whitman, I've spent 20 years proving you wrong, not just about me, but about the entire philosophy you represented. Every person on this wall is evidence that your realistic expectations were just failures of imagination.
Marcus
returned to his desk, studying Patricia's stricken face. This was the moment he'd unconsciously prepared for since he was 17, the chance to show her exactly how wrong she'd been. To make her feel the same crushing inadequacy she'd inflicted on him, but looking at her now, Marcus realized something unexpected. The victory felt hollow. Patricia Whitman wasn't the towering figure of authority she'd once been. She was just a woman in her 60s, struggling to find work in a profession that had moved beyond her methods. 20 years ago, Marcus said, quietly, you told me I would fail. You painted a detailed picture of mediocrity and disappointment that haunted me for years. You used your authority as an educator not to inspire me, but to crush any dreams I might have had. Patricia's hands were shaking now. Please, I carried your words with me like poison, Marcus continued. For months, I lived down to your expectations, convinced that someone with your experience must be right about my limitations. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But here's what you didn't account for. Some people, when you tell them they can't do something, use that crushing weight as fuel. They let the fury of being underestimated burn away every excuse, every moment of self-pity. Marcus walked around his desk, coming to stand beside her chair. That boy you wrote off went home and made a decision. He decided he would rather die, trying to prove you wrong than live knowing you were right. And he did prove you wrong, Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He not only succeeded, he built an empire dedicated to helping exactly the kind of students you convinced to give up on themselves. Patricia was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 20 years of impact crashed over her. Every student You convinced to lower their expectations, Marcus said. Every young person you taught to accept failure as inevitable represents a tragedy you were too blind to see. The office fell silent, except for Patricia's quiet sobs. Marcus had imagined this moment countless times, but he'd never expected to feel what he was feeling now. Not triumph, but sadness, for all the potential that had been lost. What happens now? Patricia asked through her tears. Marcus returned to his chair and picked up her resume. Now we finish this interview. Because despite everything, you're here applying for a position that could genuinely help people. The question is whether you've learned anything from the past 20 years? Patricia wiped her eyes and looked up at him with something that might have been hope. I'd like to think I've learned something, she said. Though I suspect that's exactly what you'd expect me to say. Marcus pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. This would be your first project if I hire you, developing a curriculum for our teacher training initiative. We're partnering with school districts nationwide to help educators identify and nurture potential instead of managing limitations. Patricia stared at the folder as if it contained both salvation and judgment. You're offering me the job? Asked in disbelief. I'm offering you the chance to spend whatever years you have left undoing the damage that philosophies like yours have caused, Marcus said. It won't be easy. You'll face resistance from teachers comfortable with predicting failure. You'll have to admit that methods you've used for 15 years were wrong. He leaned forward. And you'll have to live with knowing that every success story you help create represents something that might have been possible for one of your former students. If things had been different, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. She asked finally, after everything I put you through, why give me this chance? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since she'd entered his office, there was genuine warmth in his expression. Because 20 years ago, a teacher told me I would fail, and I spent 2 decades proving her wrong. But proving someone wrong isn't the same as making things right. He gestured toward the wall of scholarship recipients. Every person in those photos succeeded despite having teachers who didn't believe in them. Imagine how many more could succeed if we changed the teachers. Instead of working around them, Patricia picked up the folder with trembling hands. I don't know if I can undo 20 years of damage. You can't, Marcus said honestly. But you can prevent 20 years of future damage. You can teach other educators to see what you missed. What if I fail at this too? Then you'll fail knowing you tried to make amends, Marcus replied. But I don't think you'll fail. You see, I've learned something about people who've hit rock bottom. They're often the most motivated to climb back up. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the back of a packed auditorium in East Oakland, watching Patricia address a room full of skeptical teachers. The transformation in her was remarkable. Gone was the rigid authority figure he remembered, replaced by someone who spoke with the passion of the converted. On the screen behind her was a photograph Marcus recognized himself at 17, slouched in a classroom chair with defiant eyes. This, Patricia was saying, is what I saw when I looked at struggling students 20 years ago. Failure waiting to happen. Potential that wasn't worth the effort to develop. She clicked to the next slide, Marcus in his Harrison Tech office, surrounded by his achievements. This is what I failed to see. This is what every struggling student in your classroom could become, if you choose to believe in possibilities instead of limitations. A teacher in the front row raised her hand, but we have to be realistic about our students' capabilities. Patricia smiled, her voice carrying new warmth and confidence. What? Let me tell you about something realistic. Realism is understanding that every human being has potential you haven't discovered yet. Realistic is knowing that your job isn't to predict futures, it's to make better futures possible. The applause was thunderous. Marcus slipped out quietly, confident that Patricia Whitman had finally found her true calling. Walking back to his car, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 20 years ago, a teacher tried to limit his future. Today, that same teacher was working to expand the futures of countless other students. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a text message he'd received that morning from one of Harrison Tech's newest scholarship recipients, a teenager from Detroit whose teachers had told him he wasn't college material. Mr. Chen, the message read, I just got accepted to MIT. Thank you for believing in me when no one else would. Marcus smiled and started his car. Some stories, he realized, weren't just about proving people wrong. The best ones were about helping people prove themselves right. Mrs. Whitman had been wrong about him. But in the end, that wrongness had led to something far more valuable than personal vindication. It had led to a mission that would help ensure no other 17-year-old would ever leave a classroom feeling the way he had felt that day. The interview was over. The real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.